So those of you that don't know, this is part 5 in a 4-part series designed to introduce you to the basics of lighting design. For those of you that haven't joined us for the other sessions, they are available on the ETC Study Hall YouTube channel. I've just posted a link into the chat there that takes you to the playlist for parts 1 through 4. This whole series is basically a verbal version of a set of downloadable posters that are available from the website that kind of introduce stage lighting essentials to teachers, educators, and those people who just want to learn from the basics. This whole series is taking part as part of the ETC Study Hall initiative. The fact that you found us here means you probably know about it. My name is Rory Fraser-McKenzie. I am ETC's market manager for Europe. I'm based out of our London office, but cover Europe, Russia, the CIS states, Africa, the Middle East, and India. Obviously, what we're talking about here is applicable worldwide, and we will try and use some of the different jargons that we're aware of from different countries, as we all call things different things. So don't feel that if you're not used to listening to a British accent, don't worry, Declan's from South Africa. Throughout the session, you can ask questions through the Q&A window. So if you haven't found it already, you'll have to go down to the bottom of your screen and there's a little WebEx button with 3 dots on. If you click on that for more options, you can find the Q&A window. So I will be furiously typing away throughout the session in response to your questions, and either I'll answer them in the chat straight away, or we'll put them to one side and ask Declan at convenient breaks as we go along. Otherwise, that's pretty much all from me. I'll hand over to Declan to go over who he is. Declan.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rory. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Making the Light Fantastic series. As Rory mentioned, I'm Declan Randall, and I'm the Training Program Coordinator for ETC, based in the London office, looking after all the same regions as Rory. So yeah, welcome. Just to let you know, our session is being recorded, and there are suitable breaks throughout the session, so we can take your questions. But Rory does an excellent job of Q&A wrangling, so I think we should be in a good place. So this session is following on from the previous 4 sessions, and one of the things that came up in our previous sessions was people asking us how you deal with stages that are not the conventional end-on or sort of traditional proscenium arch kind of stage, because the lighting design approaches tend to be a little different. So that's what we want to have a look at in this session. So let's kick that off if my PowerPoint will work. Good, there we go. So what I've kind of done to sort of simplify this is I've basically sort of broken venues down into 4 sort of basic stage configurations. And I would think of that as being proscenium stage or an end on, so anywhere where the stage is at one end of the room and then the audience is all sort of facing in one direction. A thrust stage, traverse. Now, I've heard some people refer to a traverse stage as promenade. I'm not entirely sure that terminology is correct. For me, a promenade space is one where the audience moves around. So there's sort of multiple sort of little performance areas, and the sort of focus shifts from area 1, 2, 3, 4. That's my understanding of a promenade, but I have heard it used when talking about a traverse stage. So that's why I've popped that in there. And the other one is an arena space, or sort of theatre in the round. G asked us a couple of things while we're talking. It's the same as all the previous sessions. I'll probably use the word actor synonymously with any performer, whether it's a dancer, a singer, a pastor on stage, if you're working in houses of worship, and likewise I'll speak of a production as a sort of generic term for whatever kind of performance you're doing, whether it's a television broadcast, whether it's a service, a theatre piece, opera, dance, drama. So it's just to sort of keep the language sort of consistent. So our proscenium theatre is where we have stage on one side, or an end on stage, stage on one side, one sort of viewing portal to the stage, and then audience all sort of facing in the same direction. Your thrust stage is where you have audience on all 3 sides. We'll have a look. We'll take each one of these and we'll sort of break them down individually and have a look at how we can approach them differently. But thrust for us is audience on all three sides. Traverse stage is, as the name implies, the sort of performance space traverses the venue, so you have audience on two sides only. And the last one is an arena stage, where you have the audience on all four sides, and that can also be a square stage or a round stage. The sort of principles will apply to either. And what we're going to have a look at, just sort of casting a quick eye as a sort of quick summary over sessions 1 through 4. Basically, we're going to have a look at how you achieve your lighting objectives for each of the 4 main spaces. So your 5 objectives, if you remember from the previous sessions, would be visibility, revelation of form, mood, composition, and information. And it's the combination and probably slight reordering of these objectives that you would do for each approach to each of the different layouts. And of course, in order to achieve those objectives, we have the 4 controllable properties of light that we can manipulate, those being intensity, color, distribution, and movement. So it's kind of combinations of all of that that we'll roll into, hopefully to give you an approach to lighting a space which is less conventional. So we'll start with what I like to think of as the easy one, being your sort of proscenium theatre. And your proscenium theatre or end-on space is marked by the fact that the audience is on one side only. So everybody is looking at the same visual stage picture. You tend to find you will have more conventional lighting positions. And I generally find that this type of theatre is much easier to design for, because the audience is all looking at exactly the same thing at the same time. They're all facing in the same direction. Obviously, depending on the complexity of the set and the nature of the production, there's some complexity that comes in there. But generally speaking, this is one of the easiest stages to design for, because you only have front light that needs to come from, face light that needs to come from one direction, because all the audience are facing the same way. Your backlight looks the same for everyone. Side light looks the same for everyone. So from that point of view, I find a little bit easier, because you kind of know what your parameters are that you're working within. The other advantage, of course, of working in proscenium theatre is you kind of know what the restrictions are. It's something that's familiar. And it makes it a lot easier. Your tech table can sit in one fixed position in the auditorium, and you're not having to sort of move around and check things from different angles. You can try different seats, of course, and I would encourage moving about the auditorium during the tech rehearsals or the dress rehearsals, so you can see what the show looks like from different points of view in the auditorium. But other than that, it's a fairly straightforward approach. So we'll just quickly recap on sort of an approach to lighting a proscenium stage. And what we've sort of based this series on is the McCandless approach to lighting, which is the idea of what we would call a 3-point general. So 2 lights coming in from the front at 45 degrees and a backlight for each area. So we've taken our proscenium space, chopped it up into our acting areas, and we start by layering in. My sort of instinct is to always start with lights that are going to provide the visibility, because that's the sort of key for me. It's our first objective, make sure we can see people. So we layer in our front lights, one from one side, coming in from the other. And if you remember from the previous sessions, we spoke about a warm and a cool fixture. That could be done with gels. If you're using LEDs, it could just be a different subtle mix on the LEDs, but we tend to have slightly different colors. It gives you a little bit more molding, gives you a little bit more shape, a bit more detail, and that contributes, of course, to the revelation of form objective. And then for each area, I would add in a backlight for each acting area. Backlights are great for giving you your separation, wonderful for setting mood. You can use them to set location, time of day. They're super, super useful. So for each acting area, I would plumb in some front lights and some backlights. And then, of course, you just repeat this pattern as it moves. And then once I've got my 3-point general covered, if I have any additional fixtures and I want to have another layer of dimensionality, something else to play with, we can start layering in some side light. And again, I would just keep those to the sort of acting bays crossing in, and that can be from a boom position or a tree position low down as more like a dance light. It could be up on the top ends of the bars as pipe end positions. It's another angle that layers in, which helps to provide visibility. It can add mood. It can help convey information. There's all sorts of your objectives that this sort of covers. But you can see that your proscenium, or your end on stage, tends to fit into quite a consistent mold. It's fairly consistent. You know, you're going to have your front lights, your back lights, your side lights, and then if you want to layer in sort of pipe end gobo washers, you kind of know what your limitations are. You know where your bars are, you know where your rigging positions are, and you kind of got an idea of how stuff needs to be focused. So I find end on and proscenium spaces fairly easy. Relatively easy to tackle. It also probably has to be said that as we go through these spaces, I find the degree of complexity increases, but also with that, the cost of mounting that production increases, because as lovely as it is to design for something that's not a conventional end-on space, as exciting as it is and as challenging as it is for a designer, it does come with its own set of complications and its own extra set of expenses. As soon as you do anything other than front on, the amount of equipment you need sort of starts to increase almost exponentially as you sort of go along. And of course, with that comes an increase in cost, comes an increase in time. It now takes longer to rig, longer to focus, longer to program. So all of these sort of things start to have a knock-on effect. And so while it always seems like a great idea at the time to sort of do something slightly more unconventional in terms of the staging of a piece, there are some quite severe practical considerations that need to go into it. I've been in situations where the decision was made to put the audience on all four sides, so to do something in the round, but there was no increase in budget, and the equipment the venue had wasn't really sufficient. So it was a real struggle. We really had to spread things a little bit thin to sort of make that happen. And we'll talk about the sort of approach to that when we get to that space a little bit later on. So our next sort of stage type that I want to have a look at is the traverse stage. And I've also heard this called an avenue stage, and I've also heard it incorrectly referred to as promenade. So, but I'm just going to call it a traverse stage because that's the sort of natural choice of words for me. So on a traverse stage, your stage runs through the middle of the auditorium and you have the audience on two sides. This is a configuration that tends to be quite popular in studio spaces, sort of black box spaces. They tend to be things that, venues that can sort of turn around and change configurations relatively easily. This is normally one of the configurations that those venues will allow, is for a traverse stage. A couple of drawbacks on that: 9 times out of 10, when you are in traverse, the size of your audience reduces. It's rare that you can get as many people into a traverse space as you can end on. So that, of course, is another consideration, and it's something that the producers have to sort of discussion that producers have to have on a sort of direct with the director, is that can they actually afford financially to mount this production with a smaller audience capacity? But assuming all of that is okay and going ahead, then I find light and traverse is actually great fun to do. Of all the shapes, it's the one that I enjoy doing the most. Traverse stages tend to have a minimal set design, largely because there's not a lot that you can't put much structure in the set, because obviously you're going to introduce some sightline issues. So they tend to be fairly open spaces, which makes it a little bit easier to deal with. There's perhaps some scenic elements at either end of the stage. There might be a couple of raised levels on stage, something like that. But generally, it's fairly minimal in terms of design. One thing, though, that does happen as soon as you start getting into a different space is you end up with an increased rig size, because you're now with audience on two sides. Obviously, you need face light for both sets of audience. So straight away, your front light rig has just doubled in size, because you have to make sure that people sitting on both sides are able to see what's going on. And I find as soon as you get into changing the sort of layout of the space, or into venues that have these sort of multiple configuration options, there tends to end up being a bit of a compromise. It's rare that venues that have multiple configuration options are, and I mean no disrespect to the design teams who put them together, but they're generally never really suited for every possible combination. There'll be one layout that works particularly well and all the bars are in the right places and you can rig things where you need them and you get great angles. And there'll be one that's just an absolute nightmare to deal with. And the others will kind of be okay. You'll be able to sort of get by. It's very rare that black box spaces with sort of multiple layout configurations work well in all combinations. There tends to be a little bit of compromise. And I guess the decision comes in quite early on as to, do I make sure that do I tick my visibility objective? Is that going to be king? Do I need to absolutely see what's going on? So for instance, on the picture on the right here, I would say that they probably chose visibility there. Just looking at the style of the production, that wasn't one I was involved in, but it looks like the kind of set and the kind of room and the kind of environment where there would have been a good, even sort of light quality across the stage. So that was probably their priority. The image on the left was a production of Oh, What a Lovely War. So there was a little bit more leeway there. Visibility was less important. We could play a little bit more with effect, a little bit more with color. So it's about finding your language. As soon as you move into these new spaces, it's about finding the language. And are you going for visibility and make sure we can see? Are you going for a lot more sort of moody, a lot more atmospheric, a lot more sort of stylized approach to the rig? So those are decisions that you can make early on, and that will help you to make informed decisions about your approach to where you want to put the fixtures. So if we have a look at the traverse stage, the thing for me that's always interesting is obviously, I would always tend to start with the lights that are going to provide my visibility. So I'll start with a front light. So I'll put a front light in for this audience and a front light in for the audience on the other side. But the interesting thing is the front light for the audience on this side is actually the backlight for the audience on the other side, and kind of vice versa. So their front light is their backlight. So you now have one system which is doubling up roles and sort of serving two purposes. And this always gets interesting to me because traditionally you think of sort of backlight as being the way that you can introduce color and the way that you can introduce the more saturated tones into the show. Well, now it's not that case anymore, because if you have a saturated sort of a dark blue, for instance, coming in from the one side, that means somebody's front light on the other side is going to be that sort of dark blue. So unless you're doing a production of Avatar, that's probably not really going to be the approach that you might want to take. What is consistent, though, is side light. On a traverse stage, side light will look the same for everyone. As well as top light will be the same for everyone. So my approach to when I'm doing something in traverse is I always start with the angles that will provide consistency for everyone, and then we sort of work from there. So what I tend to do is side light is kind of key for me. So I'll sort of plumb in a side light system, and then I add a sort of top light system that comes in on top of that. And then I'll sort of worry about adding in any sort of front fills and things like that that we may need. Like everything else, what I tend to do is I start by dividing the space up into acting areas. And you can see here for these little acting areas, there's quite a little bit of sort of overlap either side of the stage. And that's sort of intentional. It's really, really tricky, and we'll have a look at this in section in a second so you can see how it all sort of slots together. But it's inevitable that you are going to get light spill into the audience. It's highly unlikely that for somebody standing on the edge of the stage and you've got a sort of backlight or front light for the other people lighting them, that light is probably going to be falling into the audience. As much as possible, always try to cut it out their eyes. I try and have a sort of limit to the sort of waist. I try not to let any light come up sort of higher than waist height, if possible. But I think it's a given that there's going to be some light spill on the audience. And I think that's when the choice is made to be in traverse, that's one of the considerations that the director and the designer are sort of thinking about, is the fact that what is that relationship between the two sides of the audience? The fact that you can see people seeing you, and you can watch people watching you. I think that there's a psychology there which is interesting. So one, I would never light them directly unless it was required. I think some natural bounce and some light into the audience is not really a terrible thing. So there are a couple of ways that you can approach tackling this sort of space. If we just have a look at a single acting area at the moment. So you can still apply your McCandless principle. You can take McCandless of the 245 45 degrees from the front from either side, and you can add that in. You can add that in for each area. So for each area, you can have 245s coming in from this side, 245s coming in from the other. Obviously, some make back down. And that kind of takes care of a bit of backlight and front light at the same time. But straight away, when you look at this, if you sort of multiply that out across 10 areas, all of a sudden that's 40 fixtures I've got to have on the rig just to provide my general cover. Yes, I'm getting a little bit of backlight and some bit of sculpting and a bit of front light all happening at the same time. So they're 40 fixtures that are going to work really hard and be really useful. But maybe that's not the best use of those fixtures. So I always tend to approach lighting traverse a little bit differently. So if we just have a look at this in section for a second, the one thing to watch when you have traverse is if you've got your sort of front light coming in, you can see sort of where it sort of falls. There'll be a point as the actor moves across that stage where they sort of fall out of light, where their head's probably going to sort of get chopped off in the light. So that's another reason why these rigs tend to get bigger and bigger, is because you need to sort of layer light in to make sure that you cover the whole part of the stage. You could absolutely cover it with one light by sort of lowering the angle, nice wide angle, and you can come in there. But you're probably going to end up with a lot of light in the audience's eyes. And what you don't want is to have people sort of sitting and squinting all the way through the performance, because as soon as that becomes uncomfortable for them, then they're sort of disengaged with the production. So I find the angles tend to be a little bit steeper when you come into traverse. You probably don't often get your 45 anymore. They probably creep up to slightly more of a sort of 50, 55, 60 starts being a little bit too steep. So you'll need to watch out for that. But that's generally the approach, is you tend to sort of layer stuff in so you can have multiple layers across. And of course, I would absolutely repeat that from the other side. If you find you're in a situation where you end up quite steep and you are getting shadows, if the venue allows it, I always do try and get something a little bit lower down that just fills under the eyes, get yourself a little bit of cover coming in. It just helps to lift those shadows, and that can be at a really low intensity, so that shouldn't be too much of a glare problem. And again, you'd probably be able to cut it off the laps of the audience, because you're really only concerned about when people really come to the front edge of the stage on either side. Something that is very common, I find, when you get into lighting spaces that are anything other than end-on, is footlights tend to be used often, because it's a great way to get a little bit of extra light up into faces. A slightly unflattering angle, perhaps, but a little bit of birdies running around the edge of the stage, just to remove some of the strong shadows that maybe the steeper angles are causing, tends to be quite a useful approach. So what I would tend to do is when I'm lighting in traverse, I don't tend to start with McCandless, the 45 degree thing. I tend to start with my side light approach, because side light is the one thing for me that's kind of consistent for everybody. And again, even though I would normally divide this up into sort of 5 areas across, and depending on the depth, either 2 or 3 areas deep, I wouldn't have 5 zones of side light. I tend to break that down. I sort of spread my side light out a little bit, because of the angle it's coming in at. You get a bit more spread, you get a bit more travel. So I tend to break that down, and I would normally only do 3 areas. I would do a left, a center, and a right. Obviously mirror that from the other side, a right, a center, a left, and then copy that across to all the areas as you need. And that's what I would then consider to be my general cover. I would, of course, add in some top light coming down into the areas. Again, I would break the top light down into 3s. I wouldn't have a top light for each of the, I mean, if I had enough equipment, yes, of course. But you tend to find equipment gets a little sort of stretched thin when you start turning venues around, which is why I break the systems down into sets of 3 rather than sets of 5. I always find it useful to divide your stage into odd numbered areas, because it makes sure that you have a center an area. So a 3, a 5, a 7, at least you've got a center area that you can isolate to if you need to. And then once I've got that done, I will then just plumb in a little bit of front light, just coming in straight from the front. And obviously repeat that on the other side, and as many rows across, as rows deep as I need to cover the stage. And they would probably run at relatively low levels. They don't need to be terribly high. I quite like the drama. For me, as soon as a space turns around, we're saying to we're sort of upsetting that sense of suspended disbelief. It's now a lot harder to convince somebody that we're sitting outside in in somebody's living room, for instance, because you've got somebody sitting on the other side of the stage. So I think it's easier to sort of push boundaries a little bit, and you can tend to a bit more to the sort of dramatic side of things. Again, the way I've sort of mapped this out, I'm sort of assuming that I'm working with an LED rig, something that gives me some color control. If I didn't have any LEDs on the rig and I was relying entirely on a generic rig, then the number of fixtures that I've mapped out here would probably double, because I would want at least 2 side lights in different colors. I'd probably want front lights in different colors, and I'd probably want a little bit of flexibility in the top light color as well. So you can see how quickly the size of the rig starts to grow. But the sort of rough layout is just kind of giving an indication of positions rather than number of fixtures. And then just a little something that's always good to do if you're working in a traverse space is I would just make sure you're adding a little bit of extra light into those 4 corners, because guaranteed those are going to be strong points for performances, for actors to play off against each other on those diagonals. There's normally entrances to the space coming in from those directions. So make sure that you've got something that's absolutely covering those, because I can pretty much guarantee that at some point something important is going to happen in one of those corners. Rory, is there anything that we should have a look at question-wise now?
I don't think we've had any questions come in yet. I think it's probably worth us kind of elaborating that while we're kind of talking about drama now, Traverse is very fashion catwalk. So you get some of the same problems with fashion catwalks. Apart from that's when they start looking at footlight, because it's frowned upon to blind your photographers who's coming to look at the fall-winter collection 2020. So yeah, Traverse, the same kind of rules apply, but you are working in usually white light as opposed to trying to color it. Fashion designers don't like it. And yeah, as you've correctly said, Traverse is commonly used to kind of highlight conflict. Think West Side Story. Clicking their way down the middle of there with 2 sides of the audience staring at each other. So yeah, it's all about making the audience aware of the other ones, but not blinding each other. As I say, if you do have questions, please fire them in while we're still talking about Traverse. Otherwise, we will move on a little bit. I don't think we've had anything that needs you to talk about at this stage.
Okay,
cool. Let's move on.
Brilliant. So the next stage that is probably worth taking a look at is the thrust stage, and that's our stage with audience on all 3 sides. And there are sort of 2 sort of flavors of thrust stage. There's one which is literally just the stage and the audience on all 3 sides, and the other is where the thrust is actually an extension of what isn't a traditional sort of proscenium or end on stage that comes out into the house. The picture I've chosen for that, I've chosen quite specifically because I think it's probably a really, really bad version of that sort of thrust extension stage. It belongs to a university, and it just looks like it'd be an absolute nightmare to light. But we'll come back and have a little chat about that in a second. The one on the left is the Courtyard Theatre, Royal Shakespeare Company's venue in Stratford-upon-Avon. So with your thrust stage, you have the audience seated on 3 sides. And the thrust can either be an extension of the proscenium stage, or it's just a venue where audiences on 3 sides. Normally, if that's the case, it tends to be slightly more sort of horseshoe shaped as opposed to a bit of sort of boxy kind of feel. But it's pretty much up for grabs how they decide to design the venues. I find thrust stages are really, really tricky to light because you have people moving through this room and behind a sort of the traditional 4th wall where you have consistent lighting positions. and all of a sudden they come forward into the thrust, and the light quality changes because it's a really difficult thing to deal with. Again, coming back to the design of venues, unfortunately, they tend to be, or they used to be, I think, newer venues where there's a bit more an awareness about the importance of stage light, or better, but certainly venues that were designed sort of maybe 30, 40 years ago, where light wasn't really considered as much. They tend to have lighting positions on stage as you would expect, and as soon as you come out onto that thrust, those positions tend to just sort of vanish, and it's really hard to match angles consistently and get a sort of even, consistent distribution of light across the stage. I find in thrust venues, thrust stages, particularly ones that have been really well designed, you're more likely to find a fixed focus rig, or at least a permanent rig installed that you can then focus and do and maybe add a couple of specials. And they do that. One of the things, obviously, that we've mentioned is any different stage space increases time. It increases the time it takes, it increases the number of fixtures you need, and so on and so on. So by having a permanent rig, it sort of helps to speed that process up, because you know that the general cover that's been focused will cover the stage, and they've sort of got, well, hopefully covered the stage and have sort of got all the sort of things covered. And then you can worry about more show specific things, the little specials that you need, the moments that you want to add and bring to. And again, the thrust stage requires even more fixtures, because you now have audience on 3 sides, so you're needing front light for all 3 sides, you're needing extra side light, extra top light, all this kind of thing. So every time you change configuration and add another bit of audience, it sort of increases the size of the rig quite spectacularly. So if we just have a look at this little thrust stage, and again, my approach always chop it up into some acting areas. And again, I've picked 9 areas, so 3 across, 3 deep. Gives me a center, but it also gives me a center, which super helpful in a venue like this, where you've got audience on 3 sides. Your stage center, that's going to be king. That's going to be where a lot of important stuff goes down. So if I just narrow this back down to a single acting area for a second, and we have a look at that. So again, I can absolutely approach this from the McCandless principle. 2 lights coming in at 45 degrees from that side. I can add the 45-degree matching so that the audience on house left has 2 lights at 45 degrees, and I can add the other light coming in from the other side so the audience on house right has the 2 45 degrees. So with 4 fixtures, I've kind of covered all 3 sides in 45 degrees, so that's absolutely an approach. Of course, I would add in the top light. Again, top light is the consistent thing here. Everybody's going to see top light in the same way. It's not the same for side light like it was in the traverse stage. Here, top light is really the only thing everybody experiences in the same way. So anything I wanted to introduce with mood, any more saturated colors, I would probably tend to plumb that in as a top light coming in straight down onto each area. The other way to do it, if you're short on fixtures, is you can just have 1 fixture. So you can just come in straight on every area for 1 fixture. And that's fine, you'll probably get away with it. But what happens is the people sitting sort of towards the back of the stage, so in this sort of upstage area, they might see a bit of shadow, and that might be a little undesirable. And what they probably will experience is they'll experience some quite saturated color on the one side of the face coming in from your top light. So, you know, if you're short of fixtures, absolutely this is an approach. But we tend to come in at slightly sort of more 45 degrees. And of course, nothing wrong in having both systems. So getting your 45-degree angle in, again, you probably find that you're going to have some that are slightly steeper because you're going to have the same problem with light spilling into the audience. So your angles tend to probably lift up a little bit. They tend to be a little bit steeper than the normal 45. So you might want to have some just flat front coming in from a little bit lower down, filling the shadows, birdies or some form of uplight, footlight along the front of the stage, whether it's a batten or a little birdie, anything like that, some LED tape, whatever it might be, just giving you a little bit of extra glow up from underneath. It's probably not a bad thing. And so straight away, you can see here on the thrust stage, if I was taking this approach, if I was doing a McCandless approach, so 45 degrees plus a top light, plus a little bit of fill for each area, That's now eight. Yeah, eight lights I've got per area. Times that by 9. That's a big rig. That's a lot of fixtures you're putting up there, and that's assuming that everything is LED and that you have some degree of color control over what you've done. If you don't have that and you're dealing with generics and you have to start doubling things up to start getting some color variation, the size of the rig just increases exponentially. And with that comes other increased things. So it obviously takes longer to rig, it takes longer to focus, it takes longer to program. So all of these things sort of start adding in time constraints, and time in terms of producers certainly equals money. The other thing for me that creeps into it as soon as you get into anything that's not end on, so for our traverse stage as well as our thrust, I find if you're lighting the show, the production desk normally tends to be in one place only, and it's normally kind of sort of out front in what I would call a traditional sort of position. But what that means is during tech or during rehearsals, you need to sort of be constantly moving around, and ideally you'd want to watch the whole performance from each seating bank, and ideally from different places in each seating bank. Maybe you don't have that many rehearsals, so it means that you're sort of moving around a lot. So it's something else that adds into the time, adds into the complexity. If you're fortunate enough to have someone who's assisting you and you can plop them in one of the other seats and take notes from them afterwards, absolutely fine. It's always worth sitting somewhere other than the director or anyone else in the creative team, because they have different eyes on things and they can see things differently. So I find working in these different configurations, communication becomes a really, really important part of the design process. You need to really get on well with the team. You need to be able to have that open conversation going, yeah, I felt like it was a bit dark in that corner. How was it from that side? That was fine on that side, but yeah, I see what you mean. So, you can have those kind of conversations. I think it's important because 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have the number of rehearsals that you need to be able to move around and see it from all the different places that you would want to be seeing it from. So the next little space that I want to have a look at is the arena stage.
Before we move on,
Sorry,
Doctor,
yes.
It sounds like there's a chipmunk with an Uzi on your line every so often. I wonder if it's worth, before you move on, just disconnecting your audio and rejoining that audio connection just to see if that improves things. It's happening every so often. It's not kind of constant. It's a little bit like cell phone interference.
That might even be exactly what it is, actually, because my
in which case, turn your phone off.
Right on top of everything. Alrighty, let's try that then.
Oh, and just to make you feel uncomfortable, Scott, who has been a loyal attendee of sessions 1 through 4, knows the venue that you were being rude about and has worked there. And
can he confirm that it would be a nightmare to work in?
It says he's done some work in the space and regularly do shows in the other theatre in their building. So it sounds like their other theatre is better.
Fair enough. Cool. Yeah, thanks for that. Good. Brilliant. So our arena stage is where we have audience on 4 sides. And oh, there we go. PowerPoint's not working. So you have audience on all 4 sides, and this can be either in a sort of square stage configuration or in a sort of round stage or seating configuration. That can kind of change. It is something that you might come across in studio and black box spaces. Normally, though, these types of venues are bespoke and they have been designed specifically to be in the round. Because of the complexity involved in staging stuff in these venues, of designing things in these venues, of the lighting rigs in these venues, they tend to be quite complicated. So normally they will be bespoke venues. And of course, the other advantage of them being a bespoke venue is that they can make sure that the seating capacity is suitable for the size of the space. Whereas if it's a black box space, you put the stage in the middle, you tend to lose even more seats if it's not specifically designed for that purpose. I find in venues like this, you'll tend to find sort of egg crate grids or sort of customized catwalk grids that tend to follow the shape of the venue to give you the positions you need. Some of them may have tension wire grids attached. Personally, I'm not a fan of a tension wire grid, not for the sensation of walking on the tension wire. I'm not sort of particularly bothered by height. The big problem for me with tension wire grids because all your fixtures live above, every time you turn a light on, the tension wire lights up and it flares. And I find it's constantly sort of catching my eye. And I'm always wanting to look up every time a sort of light changes. So I'm not a huge fan of a tension wire grid. But of course, in spaces like these, they are super useful. And again, the rig size increases again. When you're working in spaces like this, everything just tends to be slightly bigger. You need more things. You've now got front light on 4 sides, all that kind of thing. So it all starts creeping in and adding to the cost and the complexity of the designs. So if we have a look start with our square space. And again, if I just want to plumb in a little bit of a sort of front light plan, obviously their front light is their backlight. Their side light is, something that would be a side light for this part of the audience is a front light for someone else or a backlight for someone else. So your one system, no one system has one job, and that can be both useful and it can also be a little bit of a hindrance. The one thing that I've found when I have had to light in the round is I actually don't aim for consistency. I don't try and have a full cool cover on the stage from all 4 sides and a full warm cover, for instance, on all 4 sides. I actually will quite intentionally put a different color on all 4 sides. And my reasoning behind that is the audience is not experiencing the same show. So no matter where they're sitting, they are experiencing a different show. They're seeing things slightly differently. They're interpreting the story perhaps slightly differently based on what they're seeing and where they're sitting. So I don't have any problem in trying to light it consistently for everyone. I think there should be a little bit, if you're going to have a different show, have a different show. So, I tend to sort of offset colors a little bit so that everything is just slightly different for everybody. But the big advantage of that, of course, is, again, revelation of form being one of our objectives. By having different colors everywhere, and I'm not necessarily talking saturated, they can be subtle tint changes, but there's enough in that just to shape things and to give you a bit more sort of molding and definition, because a side light is a front light, is a backlight, depending on who's viewing it. Having it in a different color kind of helps to tell that story a little bit. Same as always, I've chopped the stage up into acting areas. On this particular stage, I've gone 5 across by 3 deep. But for me, if you haven't seen the previous series, an acting area for me is typically about 2.5 meters, about 8 to 10 feet wide. That's kind of sort of how I sort of break that up. So sort of 2.5 to 3 meters, depending on how much gear I've got and how much isolation I need. So again, there are 2 ways that you can approach this. You can come in, and here, I'm less concerned about the 45-degree thing here because I'm coming in from 4 sides. So depending on where you're sitting, you're probably kind of getting close to that anyway. So I just tend to come in fairly straight from each side into each acting area, adding a little top light for each area, because again, top light is now absolutely the only thing that's going to be consistent for everybody. That's the one thing that everyone is going to see exactly the same effect. It also brings up an interesting point that, if you needed a special, for instance, and you're in an arena stage, unless it's just a single top light special, it's never just one light. You're going to have to hit that point from at least 2, but probably 3, if not 4 angles for every time you want to do something really dramatic or special or highlight someone. Otherwise, someone is going to see something that it might not be right, might not be what you intend. So if we have a look at sort of a stage in the round, again, same kind of thing. I'll chop it up into acting areas. And on my initial run of acting areas, I've probably been a little overzealous here. We probably don't need this many areas on the stage. But, it's a starting point. Again, there's an overlap on all the areas. And if we have a look at just one of the areas, I can choose, again, same thing, pick a front light, come in straight from the audience's point of view. But actually what I find slightly more interesting with theatre in the round is I tend to just come in from 3 sides. So firstly, it reduces the number of fixtures I need, because that just sort of chops it right down. I have 3 front lights per area as opposed to 4. So, a quarter of the number of fixtures have now been sort of saved that I can repurpose for other things. I will still always add my top light in because it's a great way to introduce mood, and it gives me, you know, some color variation. And as always, this is assuming that I've got something that can change color coming into this. So just this little thing on the side, that's probably actually slightly more realistic in terms of how I would have divided the stage into areas. I would have sort of chopped that up, been a little bit more generous on my areas, and probably not, I have 17, I probably would have gotten out something like 9 areas. One of the advantages of doing something like 9 is then I find when you're talking to people about the stage, it becomes slightly easier, because the problem is, how do you come in, what's upstage, what's downstage, what's stage left, what's stage right? It becomes a really difficult thing. So it's about finding that language. And for me, there are 2 ways that you can do it. You can either use sort of points of a compass, so you can be north, south, east, west, northeast, etc., etc. You can do points on a clock, 12 o'clock through, but again, it's all relative to where you're sitting. So ideally, when you're planning out your space and you're chatting with the creative team, it's good to find that common ground, something that means something to you. So from this point, that's our sort of north, and then everything works around from there. So it becomes an easy way to sort of communicate about the thing. And I think with any of these spaces, whether it's traverse, thrust, arena, in the round, any of these things, I think that's when moving lights, more than perhaps end on, really need to come into play and should be a part of your budget and should be a part of your planning. They just open up the possibility of what you can do. You know, even if you only have 3 or 4, they become your refocusable specials. They become things that you can swing around and pick up an extra light in the corner or pop a top light down onto somebody. LEDs become hugely important in these things. They for me, the introduction of and the improvement of LED technology has been a game changer in terms of lighting less conventional spaces, because you can have fewer fixtures that can just work so much harder. You don't need 3 or 4 sets of systems up in the rig now. You could just have one front cover system that is LED, and that can be a warm and be a cool and be a lavender or be a pale pink or whatever it needs to be for that moment. So those, you know, when you're sort of planning this out, if budget needs to be spent anywhere, I would tend to go down that route. I'd absolutely make sure I've got a couple of movers that I can pepper about the space, because that gives me a great opportunity to fill some holes, cover anything that I may have forgotten, and particularly if you've got at least 3 of them up there, you can guarantee that you can kind of pretty much get any sort of angle that you need. Footlights always super helpful in these things, so it helps get rid of any shadows under the eyes. And obviously, as soon as you're in the round, it's important to keep moving all the time as you're lighting stuff. Move around, have a look at it from somewhere else. Hopefully, you've got the time in the schedule. Hopefully, you're brought into the production stage early enough in the process that you can be having these conversations with the production team. You can say, look, you know, I'd love to do it in the round. It's going to be super exciting, but we need to understand that it's going to be more expensive because we need more time to rig, more time to focus, more time to program. We need more lights. We need more rehearsal time because, you know, we need to be able to see the show from different locations. All of those kind of things. Hopefully you've come into the project early enough that those conversations could be had. Rory, have we got any sort of questions that we can?
This one's hot off the press. I haven't even read it yet.
Excellent.
Phil asks, he'd be interested to hear Declan's thoughts on if you dropped the idea of having warm and cool directions to a lighting area for a more neutral or a white light color, especially when doing a generic only rig or when intelligent fixes are limited.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the warm and cool thing is a nice to have, but of course it's going to increase the number of fixtures that you need. The nice thing for me about tungsten, I'm still a big fan of tungsten as much as I love what LED can do. I grew up in the era of tungsten, and I cut my teeth working with tungsten. But the beautiful thing about tungsten is within the dimming curve, the sort of 0 to 100% of tungsten, you've got a huge range of color available to you. You can go right down from the sort of really deep, nice golden ambers up to, depending on the fixture you're using, you can get it up to quite a nice sort of quite bright white. And again, the lovely thing about color is it's all relative. So if you have a tungsten fixture running at 80%, it's going to look a lot whiter than something that's running at 40%. So already you kind of just with an open, I mean, even if you just go open white, there's a huge range of sort of color that is available to you before you even worry about, do I go down a warm and a cool route? If I was locked into, say, just a set of tungsten fixtures, what I would probably do is and I don't remember the Roscoe number off the top of my head, but I'd probably go with a Lee 203, which is a quarter blue. So it's just a little bit, so when it's at its high values, it sort of corrects it and becomes quite a cold white. But anything less than kind of probably 70% and actually sort of warms up quite nicely. So that then gives you that little bit of extra coolness if you did want to sort of play with that. Sometimes you need to be able to just make sure that I can see, and coverage and a good even coverage on stage is all you need. And there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to use lots of colors. You don't have to use all sorts of little tricks and toys. As long as you can get a good coverage across the stage, the audience can see what's going on, and that story comes across. There are other tricks you can do. The timing of your cues, the angles that you choose, all of that stuff can go a long way to helping convey information. So and create mood and all those other objectives. So it's not always essential to make sure that you have split color rigs and two-tone lighting or anything like that. I hope that helps. But
yeah, I think that I would kind of look at it from the perspective of my general cover would probably be one color that would be quite neutral-ish, as you say, and then I'd either be looking at a scroller wash, so at least I have some choice of some saturated colors, either as top light or as an additional wash, depending on units. Or if I don't have scrollers, then maybe I'm looking at a couple of colors of top light wash and a kind of generic cover for my fill, just so that you can introduce a bit of color without completely having to double up all of your units. And
I mean, one of the other nice things about doing things in different configurations is it tends to bring everything a lot closer together. And one of the nice things about that, of course, is you get a lot of bounce. So other ways to get color and toning in is through your top light. So whether that's a scroller wash or just a par and anything, that light that's going to bounce off the set is going to also introduce more color into the space. So you don't have to have two-tone general cover. A single color or no color, as the case may be, front light washes is absolutely fine.
Another question that's kind of related from Stephen. How do you work in front tonal ideas in the blending and toning traditional approach? Is this a must-have in every show for you?
No, not at all. A lot of it depends on style of the piece, period of the piece, and kind of what it is. A lot of those choices I tend to make based on available equipment and also how well I know the director. Some directors who I've worked with a lot, if I know that they are very much, I have to see faces, I need a lot of light on faces, then I probably will go in with, two lights coming in, banging in from the front and just kicking it in there. My style, if I have one, I've always been loath to say that I have a style, but everybody does, is excuse me, is to actually normally only come in with a single shot from the front just to fill any shadows, and then I tend to sort of flatten stuff out to the sides. I tend to like a sort of quite nice low sort of side front light angle to sort of graze across faces tends to be my preference. What I also find I do, and it always, without fail, gets me into trouble with new directors, as in new who I'm working with, not new to directing. What I tend to do is front light tends to be the last thing that I add into my plot. I will always, if I'm building up a queue, I tend to start with my backlight first, then I'll add the side light. Chances are there's going to be a gobo because I like a bit of gobo. So, I'll add in the texture, I'll add in all of that sort of stuff. And quite often what that means is, because I've been under pressure, normally by the time we get to the first tech rehearsal, there's probably not a lot of front light in there. And directors will go, oh, I can't see faces, and that's fine. Because I add the front light in then as we go, because I can see exactly where people are, what their costumes are, which direction they're looking in, all that kind of thing. I can go, oh, you're over there. Okay, have some front light. That's great. Update that cue. Ah, you're over there. A little bit of front light for you. So I tend to sort of layer that in afterwards. So a lot of the toning for me comes from whatever else I've built previously to sort of shape that that sort of state. I do like to try and get at least 2 colors coming in on someone, just to give me a little bit of extra variation, a little bit more sort of depth, and create a bit of interest. But front light, traditional front light, tends to be one of the last things that I'll plumb in. Normally always there, but it tends to be the last thing that I add. And I found that, if you start with your front light, if you have nothing else on and you put your front light in and you get the front light to the level that the director's happy with, it tends to always be quite high. And then I find it much harder to create mood, because once that front light's blazing in, to get the backlight to read and you might not have enough punch left in those fixtures. Where if you start the other way around, then, and also particularly helpful if the director has already seen the face in shadow, or a shadowish form, then any front light you put in is normally enough to sort of get them on side and to get them to sort of buy into the look that you're creating. I hope that answers the question, Steve.
I think so. And I was talking to Declan before the session earlier on today about how my experiences of working in these non-end-on performances are normally limited by resources. A lot of my work was in kind of the education sector for a large period of my career, and it was always either not enough dimmers or not enough fixtures, and so I would always end up in almost the TV style 3-point lighting, much as Declan covered in the arena idea of 3 different lights that are providing from different angles with a mix of different colors in there to get those kind of tones. So yeah, it kind of changes that way. Just see if there's any other questions have come in. This one's extra technical for you. How do you tend to patch, by direction or by area?
I do.
Or by magic sheet.
I tend to go by direction. It's kind of tricky. It's kind of a combination of both, I suppose. I'm fairly consistent in terms of how I will number things. So my front of house will always be sort of, as I'm looking at the stage from my left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then its partners will be 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So the first number dictates the system, and the second number is kind of the area that it's lighting. That tends to be sort of how I probably have a little bit of a fusion between the two. I tried something, and that's the way I've been doing it ever since I started. And then a few years ago, I thought, oh, I've come up with a new way to number rigs, and this is going to be fantastic. And I came up with a 3-number system for every instrument. And the first number was its position, the second number was the type of light, and the third number was where it was on the bar. So, for instance, if it was on LX1, it would be in the 100 series. If it was a wash light, it would be in the 220 series, and then it was wash light number 3. So 1, 2, 3 was LX1, a wash light, third light long. So it makes sense in theory. But, when you're under pressure and you're trying to sort of call numbers and think, firstly, I've got, 3 numbers that I'm trying to remember, and it was new. And so I tried that once and then abandoned that idea quite quickly. I think if I'd done it right from the get-go and that was a natural way of working to me, it would have been fine. But I'm fairly consistent. My front of house is normally in the 10s and 20s. Then I always go to backlights. My backlights will be 30, 40, 50, depending on what they are. Then I drop down to my sides, and I always number. I start in bays. I always start, again, on my left, so stage right, 1, 2, 3, 4, moving up stage. Then I come across to downstage and go 5, 6, 7, 8, whereas some people go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are kind of different ways to do it, but that's sort of how I've done it, and I always sort of pepper my moving lights right up high at the end. So it kind of sort of varies really, but I'm fairly consistent in that sort of approach. I mean, I think, one of the things when we're looking at different spaces is a huge part of the success of turning a venue around or having something in a different configuration comes down to the design, particularly on a thrust stage. Less so perhaps for any of the others, because there's probably minimal design in arena and traverse stages. But in a thrust stage, there's normally, because you've got that sort of bit of stage area at the back, there's normally something. And I think what makes it successful and what makes it easier is if the design allows for some logic or some motivation to the shift in quality on light on stage. So if there's a huge window upstage, that's great, because you can just blast some sunlight or moonlight or whatever it needs to be through that window. And then that becomes your justification for the shifting quality of light as people come down stage, because they're moving away from that source. So those are also considerations that make it a little bit easier to certainly sell the concept.
Excellent. Nothing else has really come in since we started talking about that. So if you do have any burning questions, please take them into the Q&A. I just thought I'd talk a little bit about how this applies in other regions, other areas outside of theatre. You kind of think of large concert touring was traditionally very end-on. I think it's U2 invented the B stage, as it's known, on the Zoo TV tour. And now you see B stages out in the middle of arenas on quite a lot of big arena tours, and they have exactly the same problem. So that's why you will often see the artist will come out to the B stage in the middle of the arena, and it will be lit with footlights, maybe top lights. They're quite careful about using the follow spots all the way out there, because they're going to be blinding the crowd who are around the B stage. So it causes the same problems regardless of what you're doing, and you just kind of need to think about how that works. I stumbled across a book on my bookshelf earlier today, which is Concert Lighting by James L. Moody, that kind of talks about some of this. Admittedly, my edition is from 1997, so it's a little bit out of date. He genuinely has a chapter called "Should I Be on the Internet?" But yeah, it's worth having a look through. There's some really nice case studies from different designers, including that Zoo TV tour, about working in different arrangements. I think there's a John Denver in Absolutely in the Round, where they talk about how do you light this but keep it intimate. So some interesting one there.
I think Phil Collins did a tour that was in the round as well, or it might have been Peter Gabriel, actually. I think might have done it first. He also did something that was completely in the round. And I think Phil Collins' Carousel tour, as the name suggests, was also in the round.
Someone has just asked for the posters link. That I've just answered that in the Q&A. It is also in the chat window as well. So if you're looking for the posters link or the link to parts 1 through 4, that is in the chat window already. Somebody has just told me that the 1997 book is older than them. That's great. That means you're still learning.
Wow, that makes me feel old.
Yeah, there you go, Declan. You're old.
That's official.
Other things that you may be interested, depending on if you've been following along with our study hall program. Over the last few days, we have started the Hamilton programming project, which was kind of kicked off with a webinar yesterday that got fully booked, which is called the Hamilton Design Discussion. So as the name implies, it's a discussion with Harold Binkley and his lighting team on the lighting design for Hamilton, and also the programming project ties in with our augmented software for EOS, where that lighting team kind of approached us with what they've been doing with augmented, and have given us incredibly awesome access to the work that they've been doing. And so the programming project allows you to work through on cues from that show. Also of interest is the augmented light lab. So those of you who are doing teaching but don't have a chance to get into venues, I've just put a link through to the augmented light lab. As again, we're great with naming things. It is a light lab using our augmented software, so it allows you to experiment with different lighting angles in a virtual environment. So if you are still teaching from a distance, your students may find that useful. There are a couple of other really interesting talks on the Study Hall channel, so do explore that on YouTube. We've had some really interesting sessions since we started this way back in March. And yeah, I think that's all that I have to say. Someone has mentioned that the Hamilton thing was well worth a watch. So do have a look at that if you get a chance.
Brilliant.
Excellent.
Well, yeah, if there's no more questions, thank you all very much for attending part 5 of our 4-part series. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you soon. Have a good weekend. Thanks very much. I'm going to end the recording now. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.